It was supposed to be a minor procedural formality. Congresswoman Aisha Bennett, a seasoned civil rights attorney, had been scheduled for a brief court appearance in Dallas Municipal Court. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe so you don't miss what they never expected to happen. A parking citation and ironic ticket slapped on her car while she was meeting with housing advocates about illegal evictions just blocks away. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she had no intention of fighting it. She'd show up, pay the fine, and move on. Simple. Except that morning didn't go as planned. At exactly 8:47 a.m., Aisha's legislative director in D.C. called her out of breath. The Department of Justice had just released preliminary findings on discriminatory eviction practices disproportionately targeting Black families in South Dallas, something Aisha had been following for months. The findings were critical, and the timing was politically sensitive. She needed to coordinate with HUD and local city officials immediately. The call dragged on far too long. By the time Aisha stepped into courtroom 3B, it was 9:19 a.m. 19 minutes past her scheduled appearance. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe so you don't miss what they never expected to happen. She entered the courtroom with her signature composure, wearing a navy suit, her heels clicking confidently against the polished floor. But the moment her presence was announced, the atmosphere shifted. Judge Harold Grayson, a silver-haired figure with an air of overblown authority, barely looked up from the bench. "Congresswoman Bennett," he drawled, sarcasm thick in his tone, "how kind of you to grace us with your presence this morning." Aisha met his gaze with calm resolve. "My apologies for the delay, Your Honor. I was on an urgent call with the Department of Housing and Urban Development regarding matters directly impacting this district." Grayson cut her off. "Save it," he snapped. "This is a courtroom, not Capitol Hill. You might be used to grandstanding for cameras, but here, you follow the rules." His voice sharpened. "You're held in contempt." "Contempt?" Aisha asked, her voice steady. $50 fine, payable immediately." Aisha raised an eyebrow but complied, pulling her phone from her purse to authorize the payment. The clerk took her card without meeting her eyes. It was a small fine, petty even, but it wasn't about the money. It was about the performance, the spectacle. Grayson was making an example of her. She could have let it end there, but Aisha Bennett wasn't built to stay silent in the face of systemic disrespect. "Fact, Your Honor," she said after the fine was processed. "I'm compelled to ask, would this courtroom have reacted with the same hostility if I were a white male attorney arriving late under similar circumstances?" The room tensed. Grayson leaned forward. "Watch your tone, Ms. Bennett. I'm asking a question relevant to equal treatment under the law," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe so you don't miss what they never expected to happen." Grayson sneered. "I'm not here for your political theater. You're inching close to another contempt charge." But Aisha didn't back down. Her eyes narrowed as she took a step forward. "With all due respect, Your Honor, it's not political theater to question whether bias is at play in a courtroom. It's a civic responsibility, especially for someone sworn to uphold the Constitution." The gavel slammed against the bench. "That's enough." But Aisha pressed on. "Your Honor, you just held me in contempt for a delay tied to my work as an elected official serving the very community this court claims to protect. Meanwhile, I've seen white attorneys stroll in late here without consequence. I have receipts. I have dates. I have witnesses." Grayson glared at her, jaw tight. Someone in the courtroom gasped. From the back row, a reporter from the Dallas Morning Ledger began typing quietly on their phone. The tension was palpable. "Either I'm wrong, and this court applies its rules fairly across the board," Aisha continued, "or I'm right, and this exact moment deserves the scrutiny of the Judicial Conduct Review Board." The silence was deafening. Decades of systemic bias, the arrogance of unchecked authority, and the power of someone unafraid to challenge it hung in the air. The courtroom remained frozen. Aisha's challenge had cracked the atmosphere, and Judge Grayson seemed to be wrestling with how far he'd let this escalate. His gaze flicked between her and the sparse gallery. For the first time, the room no longer felt like his domain. He could have ended it there, dismissed her words as a nuisance, but something had shifted. Aisha wasn't just another politician picking a fight, she was someone unafraid to confront authority when the truth demanded it. "I move for recusal," Aisha said, her voice firm. A stunned pause followed. Grayson scoffed, smirking. "Denied." But Aisha had already planted the seed. "I move for your recusal from this case on grounds of demonstrated bias and retaliatory conduct." Grayson leaned back in his chair, theatrical. "You believe I'm retaliating against you over a parking citation, Congresswoman? I believe you used your authority to publicly reprimand and fine me." Aisha replied. Not for my conduct, but for who I am, what I represent, and the fact that I had the audacity to speak when you expected submission. Gasps echoed from the gallery. A young black man near the back muttered, "Damn," under his breath. Grayson slammed his gavel harder. Enough grandstanding. You've made your little statement. Now either conclude your business with this court, or I'll have you escorted out. Aisha didn't flinch. If I'm to be removed, let the record show it's for questioning racial bias in a public courtroom. A murmur of support spread through the gallery. Reporters recorded on their phones despite the no device signs. The clerk glanced nervously at Grayson, who seemed rattled by the shifting momentum. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe so you don't miss what they never expected to happen. From the corner of her eye, Aisha noticed two assistant district attorneys whispering. One of them, a Latina woman named Marisol Vargas, met Aisha's gaze with a flicker of silent solidarity. Grayson exhaled, his demeanor shifting as he tried to regain control. Ms. Bennett, you may be an elected official, but in this courtroom, you're a defendant. I won't indulge this circus. Sit down and let me finalize your citation. But Aisha didn't sit. She stepped closer to the bar, separating the audience from the attorney's floor. Let the court take judicial notice, she said clearly, that the Honorable Judge Harold Grayson has issued a contempt charge for tardiness caused by a legitimate governmental emergency, refused to address potential racial disparities in courtroom treatment, and denied a recusal request without hearing arguments or considering a written motion. Grayson was fuming, his hands gripping the bench. I don't care what office you hold, he growled. You're not entitled to lecture this court. Aisha cut in. Try it, Your Honor. Try removing a sitting U.S. representative from a courtroom because she refused to be disrespected by a man who should have retired when flip phones were still a thing. A few snorts of laughter broke through the tension. Grayson slammed his gavel again. You're dangerously close to criminal contempt. And you're dangerously close to a federal ethics complaint, Aisha said coolly. Your call. The bailiff hesitated, unsure how to proceed. Grayson barked. Well, remove her. But the bailiff didn't move. Instead, the courtroom door swung open, and two figures entered, representatives from the Judicial Oversight Commission. They were scheduled to review procedural fairness next week, but someone had tipped them off early. Aisha knew exactly who. From the gallery, Marisol Vargas stood. Your Honor, she called calmly. As an officer of the court, I'd like to request a brief recess in light of emerging concerns about judicial conduct. Grayson whipped his head toward her. Out of order, Ms. Vargas. No, sir, she replied evenly. You are. Gasps filled the room. The momentum had fully shifted. Grayson looked like he'd swallowed glass. He reached for his gavel but stopped short, leaning back in his chair as his eyes scanned the Judicial Oversight Commission members already taking notes. He'd lost the room. Standing tall, Aisha turned slowly toward the gallery. Her voice dropped, intimate yet piercing. This isn't about a parking ticket. It never was. But now people are watching. Reporters were already tweeting. Bennett confronts courtroom bias head-on, sparks fly. The story was taking on a life of its own. Aisha wasn't playing to the cameras, though she was playing for the people who'd come to court expecting injustice and found it confirmed. It's about starting a conversation this city and this country have been too afraid to finish, she continued. Equal protection under the law doesn't mean equal words in a statute, means equal treatment in rooms like the one I stood in this morning. With that, she turned and walked out, parting the courthouse steps like a modern-day trailblazer. By mid-afternoon, the courtroom clash had gone viral. Major networks looped the footage. CNN picked it up within hours. Hashtags like Bennett versus Grayson and courtroom bias trended across platforms. What started as a minor citation had ballooned into a full-blown reckoning. Civil rights groups issued statements. The ACLU of Texas called for an investigation into Judge Grayson's history, and local activists released affidavits from past defendants, Black and brown residents subjected to excessive fines and arbitrary contempt charges. Not everyone sided with Aisha. The Dallas Bar Association issued a cautious statement warning against politicizing courtroom decorum. Conservative pundits accused her of weaponizing race to dodge accountability. One far-right anchor sneered, if she can't handle being told to follow the rules, maybe she's not fit for public office. But Aisha didn't waver. She was built for this. That evening, she held a press briefing at her district office. Cameras rolled as she stood before a wall of community members, past defendants, local attorneys, activists, and clergy. Not a single chair was empty. I'm not asking for sympathy, she said. I'm demanding accountability. From the back, someone shouted, you've got it. Applause erupted, not for a performance, but for a shared reality. Behind the scenes, Tension brewed. Aisha's chief of staff warned her of growing backlash, anonymous threats trickling in, social media trolls flooding her mentions. A mysterious envelope arrived at her DC office, empty except for one typed line: "You should have stayed in your lane." Aisha read it once and filed it under security review. By the next morning, the story had gone national. A New York Times op-ed titled "The Courtroom Clash That Could Change Everything" ran with a sharp lead. What started as a $50 fine may cost Judge Grayson his robe. Grayson stayed silent, no interviews, no statements. But behind closed doors, things were moving. Courthouse sources leaked internal memos and whispered accounts of past complaints against him, dozens, all dismissed or ignored. A pattern emerged: harsher penalties for defendants of color, more interruptions, more fines, more silencing. The curtain was finally being pulled back. An emergency meeting of the Judicial Oversight Commission was set for Friday. Rumors swirled that Grayson had hired legal counsel. Meanwhile, Aisha didn't slow down. She launched a task force with civil rights lawyers and policy advocates to draft legislation mandating bias training for municipal judges, community-led courtroom observation programs, and new oversight mechanisms. The days after the clash were a whirlwind of media appearances, legal consultations, and growing public support for Congresswoman Aisha Bennett. News outlets nationwide amplified the tension between her and Judge Grayson, turning a small confrontation into a broader conversation about racial justice, courtroom bias, and abuses of power. By Thursday morning, the Judicial Oversight Commission held its highly anticipated emergency meeting. The city watched closely. It wasn't just about Grayson anymore, but the systemic issues he embodied. Grayson himself was absent, his lawyers standing in. The storm, though, was gaining strength. Aisha stood just outside the hearing room, preparing for her moment. The press swarmed outside, cameras flashing as she emerged. Her resolve had only hardened since the confrontation. What began as a petty parking ticket had become a battle for accountability and fairness, resonating with people of all backgrounds, especially Dallas's Black and brown communities, long burdened by the invisible weight of racial bias in the justice system. A Dallas Morning News reporter caught up with her as she approached the podium. "Congresswoman Bennett, do you think Judge Grayson will be removed from the bench?" Aisha paused, letting the question settle. She didn't know how it would end, but she knew she'd already won the first fight. The conversation had begun. "Judge Grayson's fate isn't just about him," she replied. "It's about the thousands of everyday people who walk into courtrooms across this city and country, people dismissed, ignored, and treated with contempt simply because of who they are. Today, I'm standing here because that kind of injustice can't be tolerated. No one is above the law, not even judges." Her words struck a chord, inspiring the crowd. It wasn't just a call to oust one biased judge, it was a demand for a shift in how courts treated the marginalized, how racial disparities were addressed, and how institutions were held accountable. Aisha's legal team presented evidence of Grayson's discriminatory practices, complaints, witness testimonies of ignored pleas, dismissed stories, and harsher sentences for non-white defendants. A clear pattern of unchecked bias emerged. By day's end, the commission ruled Judge Harold Grayson would be temporarily suspended pending further investigation. The decision set a precedent for holding judges accountable statewide. It was a victory not just for Aisha, but for countless others whose voices were finally heard. The next morning, Grayson's office confirmed his resignation, citing personal reasons. Many saw it as an admission of guilt. Some speculated he'd been given an ultimatum: quit or face removal. Either way, it was a turning point. The aftermath rippled beyond Dallas. Aisha Bennett's name became synonymous with the fight against judicial bias and racial injustice. Activists nationwide praised her courage. Her inbox flooded with support. Critics, especially conservatives, accused her of grandstanding, but she remained unfazed. This wasn't about recognition, it was about change. In the weeks that followed, Aisha collaborated with civil rights groups, legal advocates, and lawmakers to introduce legislation for judicial transparency, regular reviews of rulings, mandatory bias training, and independent complaint bodies. The bill gained traction, fueled by the spotlight she'd cast. Meanwhile, calls for reform grew louder, public pressure undeniable. Aisha knew this was just the start of a movement bigger than herself, a reckoning for a system that had long favored the powerful. As the sun set on another busy day in Washington, Aisha stood by her office window, reflecting. The road ahead was long, the battles ongoing, but she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She'd held a judge accountable and sparked a fight for fairness that couldn't be ignored. The courtroom was where it began, but the battle for justice would continue across the country for as long as it took to ensure no one was treated as less than equal under the law. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and like the video.